Okay, starting to see people show up. Some names I recognize. Hi, Nikki. Hi, Shelly. We'll give it another minute or two for people to keep filing in. Hi, Nikki. Yeah, we have participants on mute, so just if everybody wants to kind of drop into the chat, just your name and where you're calling from today, that'd be great. So we got Maine, Maryland, Detroit, Seattle, Boston, New York City. Wow, another New York City. Philly. Oh, hi, Karen. We got another 30 seconds or so, and then we'll get started. Still a few people filing in. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today. I know everybody's schedules are really busy. I'm Bram Wessel, and I'm the co-founder of Factor, and I'm here with Connor Cantrell, and Connor is going to take you through using AI to rebuild enterprise taxonomy today. So just a quick intro. We're Factor Enterprise Information Architecture Consultants, and the reason that we have these webinars is because we really value sharing what we're learning with our customers, with the broader world. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Connor to introduce herself and begin the webinar.
Thanks, Bram. So as Bram mentioned, I am Connor. I'm an information architect here at Factor. And before I came to Factor, gosh, over a year and a half ago now, I worked in academic libraries for almost a decade, doing everything from like cataloging in the back to answering random reference questions up front. And while I do love solving information architecture problems, I am still known to reorganize the occasional bookshelf. So this presentation stems from my experience redesigning taxonomies, both as a consultant dropping in for a specific project, as well as more embedded support maintaining taxonomies over time. And one question that I get asked quite a bit is, why should I care about taxonomies? So if you're in this webinar, you've probably heard this question in some form or another at least once. So I want to pause for a moment for the first of several engagement points for you. And I'd like you to answer this question in chat. So like if a non-taxonomist colleague came up to you and was like, why should I care about taxonomies? What would you say?
Go ahead, don't be shy. Just drop something in chat. All right, we're getting some responses because you need to know what stuff is so you can track and measure it. Improves the searchability of assets, delivers the best precise results and saves you time. Meaningful, organized enterprise data makes things findable. Improves scalability, content isn't useful unless it's organized. Lots of really good responses here.
Awesome. Well, y'all are definitely overachievers because you've pretty much anticipated what I'm going through my next couple of slides, which is when someone asks, why should I care about taxonomies? What we need to try to be able to tell them is because of what taxonomies enable in the enterprise. So as taxonomists, it's really important that we're able to communicate why the work matters. And there are a few high value capabilities that taxonomists help enable. And I can see from your responses that a lot of these are going to sound familiar. And these capabilities are typically what, say, like an executive probably cares about. And being able to explain these capabilities helps build an argument for why taxonomy maintenance and design needs resourcing. So, what are the typical capabilities that a business wants to enable using taxonomies? First is data quality. This is the foundational capability for most business initiatives. Poor data quality can cause new tools that ingest your data, such as an AI tool, to fail. At Factor, one of our favorite maxims is garbage in, garbage out. One of the most important requirements for managing a taxonomy is understanding who has decision-making power over specific domains, which are the conceptual area the taxonomy describes. This enables future growth because in times of change, everyone knows who needs to sign off on that updated brand name or new tool implementation instead of spinning wheels trying to figure out next steps. Standardization and consistency is what builds trust across teams in an enterprise. One of the most important functions of a taxonomy program is to apply standardized and consistent metadata so that content operations can run smoothly. And to that end, each piece of content should have a goal and ways to measure its effectiveness in meeting that goal. Otherwise, you're liable to just create content for the sake of content without a cohesive strategy, which in turn can lead to the proliferation of ineffective content. Accurate metadata that is consistently tagged to your content allows you to know if your content performs as intended and supports the business initiatives. And then for a variety of legal, regulatory, brand, risk management reasons, businesses generally want updated and consistent messaging published both internally and externally. Appropriate tags ensure that stale content can quickly be identified and updated or removed as needed. Together with content analytics, this capability reduces ineffective content and facilitates the creation of effective content, however you define that. Finally, the buzzword of our time, the automation and AI capability is particularly vulnerable to problems from poor quality data, which can include missing values, inaccuracies, biases. These can cause unreliable or even incorrect results depending on the nature of the tool in question. So I want to pause for a moment here, and I'd like for you to respond in chat again. And I'd like to know, what are the top 2 capabilities your organization is looking to enable? So you can pick any 2 that you think are your top priorities.
Starting to get a few responses. Oh yeah, now they're coming quick. Data quality, a couple of times, personalization and metrics, a couple of AI automation and standardization ones, quality, standardization, consistency, and automation.
Awesome. You know, it's interesting how standardization automation seem to be a prominent theme across a lot of the responses here. I like doing this exercise in these kinds of webinars because I think it shows that a lot of us are kind of in the same boat. As much as like we have different contexts and pressures in our organization, we really are kind of working towards the same thing a lot of the time. So hopefully you feel a little less alone. Okay, so the reality is that you can't have fancy information capabilities without strong information maturity. What's on screen is a detailed look at Factor's information maturity scale, which we use to evaluate a client's information maturity, which can range from really reactive and ad hoc at that lower end to really proactive and continuously improving at the highest end. So as you can probably tell from this scale, an organization's information maturity is comprised of several different features. That includes like the UX research apparatus, content strategy, data insights, and information strategy, including, yes, taxonomies. It's possible each of the elements here may be at a different maturity stage. For example, an organization can have, a really established understanding users component, while maybe having more of like a grassroots information strategy component. But the overall maturity stage for the enterprise may average out to like emerging. So this is why it's important to recognize that like while taxonomists can't control like all these factors or influence like everything going on in an organization, by upscaling the maturity of their own area, they can still have an enterprise-wide impact by increasing the overall maturity. And additionally, it's good to know that increasing like taxonomy maturity may encourage or even allow other areas to increase their own maturity. Okay, so what are the practical steps of taxonomy design that a taxonomist can control? I mentioned at the beginning that some of my experience as a consultant has been on taxonomy projects with like definite starts and ends. These tend to, I think, be more intensive lifts that proceed in like a very linear fashion. But I think it's usually more appropriate to think of taxonomy design as a cycle, hence the big circle on screen. After all, I do think it's a living, changing structure that needs to be able to adapt to your business needs. And a taxonomy is always in at least one of these phases, from like the request form is open for suggested changes to like we're actively adding 6 new products to the hierarchy now for a new release next week. You don't need to proceed through like every step when you make a change to the taxonomy, but the outcomes of each phase, which I'll get to in a moment, always need to be accounted for. I'll also own kind of a missing element in this cycle, which is like that implementation phase. While implementation does have design implications, this presentation is mainly going to focus on the process of adding, editing, and deleting terms. And I see implementation as primarily an exercise in applying a more or less stable list. Okay, so what does each step in this cycle entail? We'll start with the feedback phase. In this phase, you need to understand not only the user problem, but also the business problem, which may not necessarily be the same thing. It's up to the taxonomists to synthesize all the information from stakeholders about what's going on with their taxonomy usage, which may be received through a UX research process, regular governance workflows, or even ad hoc comments. I also want to flag that this phase offers key relationship building opportunities. One of the reasons I included all that context about like capabilities and maturities is to really hammer home the notion that taxonomies do not exist in a silo. I think the value of getting user feedback on taxonomy design isn't just to make the taxonomy better, but to gain buy-in from those stakeholders on the value of the taxonomy program. Then we come to the collect taxonomies phase. What you're looking to get here is a complete catalog of the current state of the taxonomies, including any modeling requirements from the systems in which they are managed and stored. You need to be able to access the definitive list of any relevant taxonomies, which might be anything from like a list of terms in a spreadsheet to like basically an ontology in a management software. You also need to understand how these taxonomies function in their systems. Like, for example, can the systems handle hierarchies? Depending on your org structure, this may require reaching out to colleagues in IT or specific content areas to collect all the taxonomies and to give them a heads up about the work underway. Then there's the organization and clean phase. Here you want to identify and remediate any issues without the context of the content set, which we'll get to the context in a moment. You're looking for quick wins to get ahead of your next draft, such as removing duplicate concepts or filling in obvious conceptual gaps. For example, let's say you're looking at a geography taxonomy and a countries taxonomy that need to be combined. The geography taxonomy includes continents like North America, South America, and Europe, and the countries taxonomy happens to include Japan. Even without looking at the content, that's a signal that Asia is a missing continent level concept that will need to be added to make the new combined taxonomy work. Next is the restructure and harmonize phase. This is where you should be introducing the context of your content set to guide your design efforts. And as a result, you should have access to whatever components of the content you'll be using. So for some projects, you might want to consider the full text of the content. Like if you're doing a proof of concept for an auto tagger, where you're looking for like very specific kinds of term matches and synonym generation. But if you're looking at like maybe kind of a higher level or like content on the scale of hundreds or thousands of assets, maybe you'll only need like specific metadata fields such as the title or date published. To use the example of like our geography and country taxonomy from the last slide, this is where you would start looking at the content to see what like continents and countries are actually mentioned in the content and not just what's present in the taxonomy. Finally, the validation phase. We've circled back around to the stakeholders from the feedback phase to confirm that our proposed taxonomy design solution solves their problems. In my experience, if the stakeholders have had a lot of involvement in and exposure to the work in previous stages, this can often be pretty much a rubber stamp and they wave on the taxonomies to that implementation phase. However, if they haven't been involved for whatever reason in the previous phases, the changes may come as more of a surprise to like a gatekeeper, and you may receive new feedback that sends you through some of the phases of the cycle again. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering, like, when are we getting to the juicy bits about AI? Well, good news, we made it. And we've come to yet another scale in this presentation. So I can try to explain what I see as the characteristics of a low-risk application of a tool versus a high-risk application of a tool. You'll hear me use qualifiers like tends to, usually, generally, quite a bit, because as in the information maturity scale, there are nuances to every context. And just because something is higher risk in this framing doesn't mean it's wrong or bad. Indeed, it may be the best option depending on the pressures of your unique situation. Also, since AI is a term forced to carry many meanings, I want to emphasize that the tools and strategies I'm talking about today span just beyond generative AI, which tends to take up a lot of oxygen in the room. I want to think about how we can evaluate a wide range of tools, which, yes, includes like the LLM your company implemented last year, but like also the basic machine learning algorithms and like a free website that helps you count n-grams. More on that in our case study later. And I want to emphasize again that these risks aren't just like a thought exercise. What you're risking on the higher end of that scale is the degradation of your information maturity and your ability to deliver the capabilities on screen. It costs time, money, and staffing to regain any real or perceived capability loss that result from high-risk automation/AI applications. So let's start with our characteristics. And I'm going to start with the agency of people in these tools. A low-risk application augments human effort rather than replacing human connection. Anytime you're reaching for automation to replace talking to and building connections with other people, you're moving into higher risk territory. Now, in the case where like certain roles aren't staffed or like are just unavailable, then like it makes sense that you would probably reach for automation, at least as a first draft. For similar reasons, I think a machine in the loop framing is lower risk than a human in the loop framing. These are very similar phrases with a key difference in agency. A machine in the loop framing suggests that augmentation I mentioned in the last slide. Machines are assisting a fundamentally human process. In contrast, human in the loop suggests that machines are controlling the process and humans only intervene for specific reasons. This may seem like a distinction without a difference, and I do see some folks using human in the loop language to advocate for greater human agency. I would just encourage you to keep that focus on augmentation rather than replacement. Next, you need to consider the type of model you're using. Deterministic models are rule-based, meaning that the inputs have consistent outputs, while probabilistic models, as the name suggests, have an element of chance, which means that the outputs aren't as reliable. Again, I'm not saying that deterministic good, probabilistic bad. I'm just saying in terms of, risk management, you're getting into riskier territory with those probabilistic models with the less consistent outputs. Additionally, the nature of the tool's training also impacts its risk assessment. Tools that are designed or trained for a specific domain or task are typically more successful and less risky at generating outputs. Think of like the word count feature or like a small LLM that someone hosts on their own computer. In contrast, if you don't know how the tool was trained, or if it's supposed to accomplish a lot of different kinds of tasks, the risk factor is going to increase as its training is generally less specific. The last, and what I think is the most important factor, you have to consider if the tool's use conforms with your organization's AI and like data use policy. Many enterprises now have in-house tools they encourage employees to use, but there are plenty of tools out there that haven't been reviewed or approved by like relevant stakeholders in-house and are much riskier to expose your data to, especially if it's like proprietary or sensitive. Now, in a perfect world, you would have like a perfect tool without risk for every task. But here in the real world, chances are that you'll have little say over what tool your company buys, or little access to like information about its design or training. What I encourage you to do is think about where you have the most influence to decrease risk. For example, like even if it's as simple as adopting a minor linguistic shift, like trying to use machine in the loop over human in the loop more, or choosing to take an extra hour to do a task more manually. In reality, you may be saving yourself and your organization a lot of time and money from cleaning up after a risky AI application. Okay, so now I want to do some practice based on some common taxonomy design tasks. Let's say you're a taxonomist that needs to overhaul your company's taxonomies. There's a lot to do in a short amount of time, so you're going to automate some of the process. So in chat, I'd like to hear how risky you think it is to like check for duplicates using Excel. And you can just let us know using like low, medium, high, where you think it falls in the scale.
Yeah, lots of lows. Medium. One medium so far.
Yeah, so I think you pretty much cracked it. This, I think, is a low risk. Excel is probably an in-house tool, or one that you're at least already putting your data in. You shouldn't have major permissions issues, and like finding duplicate terms is a pretty verifiable process that you'd be doing alone anyway. So this really isn't super risky. Okay, so how risky do you think it would be if we generate new terms by uploading content titles to a free website that identifies frequently used terms?
Medium, medium high, low medium, medium, medium.
Okay, so I have to admit, I got a little tricky here, because this is a chance to break out one of my favorite phrases in IA, which is "it depends." So public content that is already surfaced online is probably pretty low risk to upload. But if it's internal only content titles that aren't surfaced publicly, there may be proprietary or sensitive information that, like even in the content titles, you don't want to upload to a free website. So I think this is a good example of ways you can start thinking about how to mitigate risk. So you could see, like, even though this is the same kind of broad situation, depending on the specifics of your content, you can make decisions that either increase or decrease the risk. Okay, so our final example here, how risky do you think it is to upload a content set to your company's ChatGPT and ask it to generate navigation categories?
Low, low. If enterprise only, low, medium, low. Enterprise only, I'm assuming, means that the chat GPT instance is confined. Medium to high, again, depending on how much IP is included. Low to medium. Medium as long as you review it.
Yeah. So I think y'all are starting to catch on to my answer key here. So there's a lot of different factors that could influence risk here. The point about like the security of the data and whether or not you can actually upload it is a great one, because even though like your company, it's like company provided ChatGPT, they still may restrict what you could put in or like what's appropriate to use it with. So, and like a couple other people mentioned, the level of human review, I think, is really going to have an impact on the risk here. So like if you're just accepting the output uncritically, like I think that's really risky. The categories may be perfectly fine, but you may get like irrelevant terms in the output. I saw someone in chat mention earlier, like if you're using like public content on a free website, you may get really generic terms too. So like, I think using it as a first draft to review allows a check on machine errors. So I think like, as long as the taxonomist is reviewing it, you're really significantly decreasing the risk. And like, especially if you start bringing in like content stakeholders in that like validation phase, I think that reduces the risk even more. And that also speaks to like encouraging the relationship between the taxonomy and content teams if they're indeed separate. Okay, so that was like a lot of theoretical stuff, but I think we're now ready to dive into the case study example. The project I'll be discussing began last August, but the client, a Fortune 500 financial services company, had originally brought us in almost a year prior to help create alignment and to improve their enterprise information capabilities. Since then, we had engaged with work streams across IT and marketing. So we were pretty familiar with the various domains, roles, and systems generally at play. So this is kind of a really zoomed out scale of that enterprise information maturity detailed look I showed you earlier. And the client was and continues to be in a major growth phase when it's natural to start thinking about advancing your capabilities. When we first embarked on the project, the client was here in the emerging phase. They had pockets of success, but they wanted capability functionality they couldn't support yet. In the case of our client who sits in intranet content IT, stronger, which is to say more rational and measurable metadata to use for content tagging, was a quick win to help push them toward that established maturity phase and unlock more advanced capabilities. And on this project, our client was specifically interested in enhancing their capabilities around data quality, scalability, and content analytics in the roughly 3.5 months we had left in the calendar year. They wanted to make sure that intranet content operations could sustainably scale up with measurable results as the company continues to grow. The intranet interface was at the tail end of some major changes. So we were brought in to align the tagging metadata schema to the new and improved content. To help push them toward that established maturity level, our central question became, how do we improve intranet content metadata? And we're going to start by evaluating a previous audit we had completed of the taxonomies using that intranet system, which ended up being 620 terms across 41 total taxonomies. And that was pretty onerous for business users trying to tag internal forum posts. And you'll notice I represent the design process here as a straight line. I know I'm already contradicting what I said earlier about the cyclical nature of the process, but because this was like a very discrete drop-in project, I'm breaking my rule and representing it as a straight line. So we move on to the next phase where we evaluate the terms and decided how to remix the taxonomies. This involved combining semantically similar terms, adding new terms to enrich the tagging and search experience, and deleting terms that no longer serve the business needs. Once we figured out how all our terms needed to be roughly grouped, we were able to apply modeling to conform with the client system requirements and taxonomy best practices. For example, the system couldn't really handle deep hierarchies, so we spent a lot of time resorting and relabeling to make relatively flat lists work in a tagging interface. But it was also at this stage that we wanted to make sure all the relevant topics and the content were represented for tagging. When we started discussing this element of the project with our client, it became clear that we had access to a number of enterprise AI tools that could help us evaluate the content. And so we embarked on a slight revision of our initial project question. How do we use AI to improve intranet content metadata? There were a few pressures to keep in mind as we discussed which AI tool was appropriate. First, as I mentioned earlier, we were working on a relatively short time frame. By the time we reached the restructuring stage of the taxonomy remodel, we had fewer than 2 months left in the project to evaluate hundreds of thousands of articles, posts, and so on. We also wanted to make sure that the client felt suitably involved in the selection process because, like a lot of organizations, they made AI a critical element of their strategic planning. And our stakeholders were quite enthusiastic about being able to report out on a use case for these AI tools. Now, I want to pause the project story for a quick digression into n-grams. I am not a statistician or computational linguist or computer scientist, and very far from an expert in n-grams. But as a taxonomist, I think that n-gram frequency analysis can be a powerful tool for validating a vocabulary. And this is what we wanted to automate using AI. So I think it's valuable to understand how it's useful in taxonomy modeling work. So an n-gram basically refers to a phrase of n consecutive words that appear multiple times in a content set. We take this sentence, for example, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. There are 9 individual words here, so 9 potential unigrams. But as I'm sure all of us here are aware, not every detail in a given piece of content is necessarily relevant for like a tagging context. So of these 9 potential unigrams, I think we can pretty confidently say that prepositions, conjunctions, any kind of filler words wouldn't be good candidate tags. So once we take those out, we're left with 6 potential unigrams, depending on whether or not they show up elsewhere in the content set. Now let's say we add another sentence to our analysis. This is where the frequency of the n-grams can help us figure out which concepts are important in the content set. We see that there are 5 unigrams in common, but unigrams alone don't necessarily capture the richness of semantics at play here. We can see there are 2 bigrams in common across the content set. Lazy and dog as 2 separate unigrams have a slightly different meaning to the human eye than lazy dog. Similarly, quick brown fox functions as a potential trigram. Maybe there are other sentences out there about a slow red fox or a quick dog, and our bigrams and trigrams, in addition to our unigrams, help us understand not just the strings, but maybe even also the concepts or the things. So let's say we have a much bigger content set. We can put it through an n-gram extraction process to produce our lists of n-grams. On screen, you can see an example of the most frequently used n-grams in the past 2 years of factor article titles, with some of those noisy filler words weeded out. Even with the help of a tool from contentharmony.com, which is linked here on the slide, it still took me some time to process the output to make it look like this. And when you're dealing with a content set from an enterprise intranet system, you're looking at thousands or maybe even millions of pieces of content to evaluate. This is why we wanted to use an automated method with an AI tool that we would expect to handle content at scale better than anything we could do on our own. It's also worth noting that n-gram frequencies tend to have a pretty long tail. But all those grams that show up 2 or 3 times are less valuable than the ones showing up 9 or 10 times. So now that we have some context for n-grams, we can get back to the project. Because of the short time frame, we were interested in a no-code solution, something that could run queries pretty much out of the box for us, because as a reminder, I am not a computer scientist. The client had access to a few different tools, including instances of ChatGPT, Gemini, and Glean, with varying levels of access to the client content as a training set. We knew the basic process would involve an export of content titles from their search system Coveo, uploading the content into the tool to run n-grams, and then looking at the top 1,000 or so results from that list. By running just the titles, we still got to the aboutness of the content without having to upload every word. And looking at the top 1,000-ish results was the estimate that would allow us to avoid most of that long tail of minimally useful n-grams. After some discussion, the client decided that their ChatGPT enterprise instance, which was trained on their content, had the strongest data analysis capabilities and should be the tool with which we proceeded. So I want to pause the case study again and ask you to put in chat, like, how risky do you think this solution was based on what we talked about earlier?
Depends on the level of human review. Not risky, but curious about determining parameters. Medium, just given the compressed time frame. Medium low, medium high, below medium toward low. Medium
Yeah,
to accuracy, human in the loop. Yeah.
I love these answers because you're already, again, catching on to my it depends human review answer key. But yeah, I think definitely this was probably like a low to medium risk. I think something that increased the risk for us specifically in this situation was like our general unfamiliarity with the client's tool. So like there was still definitely a learning curve on like the parameters that someone mentioned, and understanding like what exactly we needed to look out for and how thorough the review should be. So I can advance my slide. After all that, our outcomes were a bit of a mixed bag. Our client was, quote, not as impressed as he thought he would be, end quote, with the results. This was in large part because much more data processing was required than we initially anticipated. The initial list of content titles was way too noisy, and ChatGPT couldn't ingest the full file of titles we were interested in evaluating. The client ultimately had to write a script to upload it all in one shot, and the n-grams didn't match the titles as well as we wanted. That being said, and at the risk of being overly recursive, this webinar is an outcome of that work. And not just for us, our client happily walked away with a potential case study for their own strategic planning around AI use. Overall, we were able to decrease both the overall term volume and number of taxonomies required to organize those terms. We ended up with 583 total terms across 12 taxonomies. And this was accomplished well within the required time frame. We even finished a few days early, which was a welcome reprieve for everyone right before the end of the calendar year. And as much as we were able to combine and delete terms, I think what we might call the qualified or limited AI assistance helped us with our term additions. Because of the way our collaboration process works, I can't tell you exactly how many terms we got from the AI output specifically, but I can tell you we added more terms than we combined or deleted, respectively. And in terms of the client's information maturity, I will admit that one 3.5-month project didn't rocket them to the next phase. Once an organization gets to the mid and high range of maturity, you definitely need a more programmatic approach to up level. And the jump from that 3 emerging to 4 established tends to be the most intense and difficult in my experience. However, in terms of the capabilities, I think we made significant progress in delivering a scalable, standardized quality set of metadata to use for tagging, which can serve as the foundation for other content capabilities in these areas. Additionally, we uncovered a whole other thread about automation and AI enablement for both us and for the client. So if we revisit that initial question, how do we use AI to improve intranet content metadata? In the context of this project, our answer was that we can evaluate content metadata in an AI tool with data processed specifically for this purpose. Our team would now expect to use at least a low-code solution for any n-gram generation, which, credit where it's due, we'd likely use an AI tool to help us script. Okay, I know that was a lot of information in kind of a short amount of time. So as we move into the Q&A portion, let us know in chat what questions you still have. You can also book a free consultation using the QR code on screen or drop us a line in our email inbox.
Excellent. Thank you, Connor. We've already got 2 questions, so I'll go ahead. You can post those in the Q&A feature using Zoom, or if you can't find that, just go ahead and drop them in the chat. So the first one comes from an anonymous attendee. Given that generative AI is probabilistic and has broad training, would you say it's more high risk? Question mark. Would you say to leaders who just want to put, what would you say to leaders who just want to put Gen AI in everything? We hear that a lot.
Yeah, this question makes me remember a situation I often ran into in academic libraries. So it was really common for students to come to the reference desk and ask for help finding sources and formatting their citations. And sometimes they would complain about like, I can't believe I have to like do all this like citation stuff. Like, who cares if it's Chicago or EPA or whatever? Like, why do I have to do this? And, there is an argument, like sometimes I would tell them like, okay, well, like it's important to understand like where you're tracing your ideas from, blah, 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 academic, whatever. But often the most effective way to talk to them about it was to say, well, it's on your rubric, like your instructor is making you do it. Um, the reality is that AI is on like a lot of our rubrics now, like regardless of whether or not it's actually like useful or a good solution to the problem, we're kind of all being graded on it, so we have to make it work. So I think from that angle, like it's okay, like if you're being forced to adopt Gen AI on an executive's timetable to like you can make the best of a bad situation. So for example, like in this, like, you mentioned like having a probabilistic, I can't remember the other feature with a broad training set. You can look at some of those other characteristics of risks to think of if you can mitigate it. So like, maybe this isn't something you would say directly to the executive, like right off, but you could start seeing like where you have influence around AI usage, like around your own tasks, and start incorporating some more like language around human agency and start like advocating for, the usage to be in the context of like augmenting something you're doing rather than like replacing talking to people. Like even if you do have to like use it a lot, treat its output as drafts, show them to other people, use that as a conversation point to start getting to know like other people's, experience of the tool. Because like if a lot of people are having a bad experience, that may have more of an impact to an executive than just like your own complaints. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, second question comes from Michael Bakhtiar. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Curious if the count of engrams justified the ranking versus also having stakeholder input slash voting.
Could you read that question for me again?
Sure. I'll sort of insert some.
Yeah.
I'm curious if the count of engrams justified the ranking as opposed to also having stakeholder input or voting.
So I think what was interesting about this specific case study was because these were like internal forum posts, we were able to treat the content set itself as, I think, kind of a form of stakeholder input. Because of the nature of the project, like we weren't able to like, we had very limited access to people who were like managing or adding to this content, but each post was something someone went out of their way to like add themselves. So we knew that that was something they cared about and like was something that was, relevant to them and they needed to have content about. So I do think for the most part that in this case study, to the extent that the engrams were relevant, which again, there were quite a few like kind of noisy or made up terms, I do think we were able to strike a balance between like stakeholder input through the content set with things that the engrams were telling us. I think another key element of this case study was that like the team who did this case study were kind of AI skeptics. This is not a team that is this is a very AI critical team that worked on this. So when we took that output, we, I think, really took a close look at it, and were very judicious about the terms that were being added. I don't know if that answers the question.
Okay, it looks like the last question we have comes from Nikki Ushandek. Hi, Nikki. How would you approach creating taxonomies in a company that doesn't have them?
That's an excellent question. And again, I would say my answer is kind of it depends, like without knowing like the specifics of your organization or having a good sense of the history of any taxonomy work. I mean, I think the questions that I would look to answer are kind of like, why aren't there taxonomies, and like what problems are a taxonomy going to solve? So that doesn't mean necessarily like going out and asking people those questions point blank like that. I think there's a lot of ways you can investigate those questions through looking at the content, through like your own understanding of, the power dynamics at play and like the content workflows. But I do think there is a role for potentially automation to help you. I mean, especially if you're like kind of a lone practitioner trying to do this big lift. That's a situation where, automation is maybe not like replacing human connection. Like that might be a place where like the connection points just like don't exist because of the context of your org. So, maybe that's a place where you're using some sort of automation tool like to help you ideate, or to handle these maybe draft lists at scale or something to that effect. But what I think the fundamental task, if you're trying to spin up a taxonomy program for the first time, is you need to get some kind of buy-in. So I think if those connection points already exist, it's going to be on you to kind of make them happen. And automation isn't going to, I think, magically create those in a vacuum. But I would also love to know, like, if there's like more specifics to this question, I would love to hear over email, because I do love a puzzle.
Okay, from Elizabeth McLean, I've noticed that computer science-based instruction on AI does not cover the application of taxonomies ontologies, but instead talks of data labeling and data science. Have you encountered this, and if so, how do you bridge that disconnect?
Yeah, so this reminds me of yet another kind of tale from library land. I remember when I was in library school, one of my favorite classes, or one of my favorite things I learned, was essentially kind of library information science, and I put kind of taxonomists under that too. And computer science often deals with the same problems. I had a really cool instructor who was like, yeah, like these two fields just like use different terms for kind of the same action. And if they would just talk to each other, they would like really just kind of solve each other's problems. So I hear you on wanting to have like greater coordination or recognition of some of the problems we're doing on like the information science, information architecture side. Unfortunately, I think it kind of comes down in most cases to kind of like the information architecture type people to force that gap, because I think in a lot of cases, the, computer science programming apparatus is going to be like really well resourced and given a lot more power than we are. And I think that's why I tend to use the language of like influence a lot, because you may not be in a position where you're like a gatekeeper, a decision maker, but maybe you can like show up to meetings. You can start that kind of like coalition relationship building over time. And yeah, I mean, it does kind of suck because like these things take time and it is kind of like extra effort, but I don't think it's impossible to be done. I don't know if that answers the question fully.
Okay, last question today is from Shelley Carr. Hi, Shelley. How would you approach advocating for unified taxonomic management when there are taxonomies found across the company in different places that are sorta kind of managed by different teams?
Well, that's $1 million question, isn't it? I'm gonna, Bram, I'm gonna volley this back to you a little bit, because I mean, I feel like this is almost like our business, right? Like this is kind of
Yeah.
the central question we deal with in almost every problem
Yes,
with
it
every
is.
client.
It is. And what we when we talk about this, we really talk about taxonomy should be an asset that can be shared across the enterprise, because in a lot of cases, domains or subdomains within enterprises overlap quite a bit. So there are terms, concepts, semantic concepts that need to be shared. And so one of the ways that we've illustrated this is by some of our case studies where we talk about how, and Connor made reference to this in talking about the case study for this webinar, is how we started with a capability and we built taxonomies or ontologies or whatever asset we needed to build for that capability. And then when the customer had another capability that they needed to develop, we were able to reuse a lot of those pieces. And they started to see, oh, well, wait a minute, if we governed this taxonomy as a shared enterprise asset, it's more like a service that other organizations can, within our company or our organization, can subscribe to or participate in, then that sort of moves you along the pathway to that unified enterprise taxonomy. So we've helped build or are helping to maintain what we call taxonomy as a service platforms in multiple companies. So that's kind of, I guess, a best practice. And some organizations are even thinking of this now as a center of excellence. So I think that's how we think about it, and how our customers are mostly Fortune 500 companies. So how big enterprises are thinking about this. Hope that was helpful. Okay, well, I think that concludes our webinar for today. Thank you, Connor. Wonderful job walking through all of the Ngram complexity. See lots of hand clapping emojis coming up. Thanks everybody for participating today. And again, if you want to consider us a resource, if you want to bounce ideas off of us, or if you have a tricky problem you want to talk about, we don't have to be formally engaged to have a brief conversation. So you can use the QR code, you can drop us an email, factorfirm.com. We're our LinkedIn presence, which is how a lot of you probably found out about this webinar, is also a good way to get in touch with us. So thanks everybody, and have a great rest of your day.